Some moments change a man's heart forever. For Silas McCrae, that moment came when he heard 3 dying dogs whimpering in the desert heat. At 55, Silas was one of the most wanted outlaws in Arizona territory, with a $500 bounty on his head and blood on his hands from 30 years of running. He'd made peace with dying alone in the wasteland, forgotten by everyone who'd ever mattered. Then near Widow's Ridge, he found them tangled in barbed wire, ribs showing, eyes dull with suffering. Something in their quiet pain stirred a memory he'd buried deep. He cut them free and shared his last water, figuring they'd die peaceful. But they didn't die. They followed him. As Silas begins asking who left those innocent creatures to suffer, he uncovers something that connects to his own dark past. Would saving 3 dogs finally give this old outlaw a chance at redemption? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The barbed wire had cut deep into their matted fur, rust mixing with dried blood in patterns that spoke of days, maybe weeks, of slow suffering. Silas McCrae knelt in the red dirt beside the 3 dogs, his weathered hands working carefully to free the smallest one, a scrawny mutt with mismatched ears and eyes that held more wisdom than most men he'd known. "Easy there, little one," he murmured, his voice gravelly from years of desert wind and whiskey. The dog didn't struggle, just watched him with that patient acceptance animals showed when they'd given up hope. It reminded Silas of something he'd rather forget. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Widow's Ridge, turning the landscape into a shimmering furnace of red stone and scattered sage. This god-forsaken stretch of territory had earned its name from the countless men who died here. Some by Apache arrows, others by bullets, most by the simple cruelty of the desert itself. Silas had been riding these trails for 3 decades. And he'd never seen anything quite like this deliberate cruelty. Someone had wrapped these dogs in wire and left them here to die slow. The biggest dog, a German shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes, had managed to partially free himself, but stayed close to protect the others. His coat was silver-streaked, and Silas could see the old warrior in him, the kind who'd fought battles and earned his scars honestly. The medium-sized one, probably part border collie, lay quietly between his companions, conserving what strength remained. As Silas worked, memories surfaced unbidden. His younger brother Tommy had always been the one to rescue strays. "Every living thing deserves a chance," Tommy used to say, bringing home injured rabbits and abandoned pups to their family's hardscrabble ranch outside Tucson. That was before their parents died of fever, before the bank took the land, before 2 orphan boys learned that the world cared nothing for the innocent or helpless. Silas pulled the last strand of wire away from the smallest dog and reached for his canteen. 3 swallows left, barely enough for himself in this heat. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then tipped the container against the little one's mouth. The dog's pink tongue emerged cautiously, lapping at the precious water with desperate gratitude. "That's all I got, boys," Silas said, offering drops to each animal in turn. "But it's yours." The worn leather journal in his saddlebag contained sketches of Tommy's face, drawn from memory over the years, the only record left of a boy who'd believed in second chances. Silas had started the journal after Tommy's death 20 years ago, filling it with fragments of memories and regrets. Sometimes he wrote letters to his dead brother, asking forgiveness for the choices that had driven them apart. Tommy had tried to go straight near the end, found himself a girl in Bitter Creek, talked about settling down, maybe raising horses instead of stealing them. But Silas had laughed at such foolishness, convinced his brother that easy money beat honest work every time. If he'd listened instead, if he'd supported Tommy's dreams, maybe his brother would still be alive. The dogs watched Silas with growing alertness as the water revived them slightly. He could see the question in their eyes, the same question he'd been asking himself for 20 years. What happens now? "Don't suppose you boys have anywhere to be," Silas said, standing and dusting off his knees. His bay mare, Jezebel, nickered softly from where she stood ground-tied 30 feet away. She'd been his only companion for the last 5 years, since his previous partner had taken a bullet in Yuma and decided outlawing wasn't worth dying for. The reputation of Silas "Gravedust" McCrae stretched across the southwest like a shadow. They called him Gravedust because he had a habit of disappearing into the desert when things got hot, vanishing like dust in the wind, only to surface weeks later in some distant town. Bank managers knew his name and wanted posters bearing his likeness decorated sheriff's offices from El Paso to Phoenix. The 500 bounty on his head had been growing for years, a small fortune that attracted every bounty hunter and desperate lawman in the territory. Marshal Pike Henderson had been tracking him for the better part of a decade. Always one town behind, always one step too slow. Henderson was different from the others, methodical, patient, driven by something more than money or glory. Silas had glimpsed the marshal's face during a close call in Flagstaff, saw the cold determination there. This wasn't a man who'd give up easy. Elena Vasquez ran the cantina in Bitter Creek, a day's ride from Widow's Ridge. She was one of the few people in the territory who knew Silas's real name, who'd known him before he became Gravedust. Elena had been Tommy's girl, the woman his brother had loved and planned to marry. After Tommy's death, she'd never looked at Silas the same way, not with hatred exactly, but with a sadness that cut deeper than any accusation. The 3 dogs struggled to their feet as Silas prepared to mount Jezebel. The biggest one, the German shepherd mix, took a tentative step toward him. The border collie followed, then the little mutt. They moved slowly, painfully, but with unmistakable purpose. "You planning to follow me?" Silas asked. "I ain't much for company these days." But even as he said it, something stirred in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. These animals had chosen him, just as he'd chosen to save them. In the hard mathematics of survival, it made no sense. 3 more mouths to feed, 3 more lives to protect, 3 more reasons for enemies to find him. Yet watching them struggle to stay close, seeing the trust in their eyes despite everything they'd suffered, Silas felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the memory of Tommy's voice talking about second chances. Maybe it was simply loneliness finally overwhelming good sense. "Well then," he said, leading Jezebel at a slow walk so the dogs could keep pace. "Reckon we'll need names if we're traveling together." The German shepherd mix moved with quiet dignity despite his wounds. "You've got the look of a ghost about you," Silas told him. "All silver and silent. Ghost it is." The border collie seemed to blend with the shadows between the rocks. "Shadow," Silas decided. "You know how to stay hidden." The smallest dog, the scrappy mutt who'd looked at him with such wisdom, kicked up little clouds of dirt with each step. "And you're nothing but dust and determination. Dust!" As they walked, Silas found himself talking to them, not the idle chatter of a lonely man, but real conversation. He told them about the country they were crossing, pointed out landmarks and dangers. The dogs listened intently, and Silas could swear they understood more than they should. The sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. They'd need shelter soon and water before morning. But for the first time in 20 years, Silas McCrae wasn't riding alone. And that made all the difference. That night, camped in a shallow cave that offered protection from wind and concealment from prying eyes, Silas shared his meager supper with his new companions. Jerky and hardtack wasn't much, but the dogs accepted it gratefully. Ghost positioned himself at the cave mouth, naturally taking the role of sentinel. Shadow curled up against the back wall, where he could watch the approaches. Dust, despite being the smallest, stationed himself directly beside Silas. As the fire burned low and the dogs settled into sleep, Silas opened his journal to a fresh page. By flickering firelight he began to write, "Found 3 dogs today near death, wrapped in wire like some kind of cruel joke. Should have left them, but Tommy's voice in my head wouldn't let me. They're following me now, God knows why. Maybe they're as lost as I am, or maybe they see something in me I don't see in myself. Either way, I reckon my running days are about to get more complicated." He paused. listening to the soft breathing of the sleeping animals, feeling their warmth in the cool desert night. Strange thing, though. For the first time in 20 years, I don't feel alone. Silas closed the journal and settled back against his saddle. Outside the cave, coyotes called to each other across the darkness, but Ghost's steady presence at the entrance made their howling seem distant and unimportant. Whatever tomorrow brought, bounty hunters, lawmen, or just the endless search for water and shelter, he wouldn't face it alone. The 3 dogs had chosen him, and somehow in making that choice, they'd begun to change him. The man who'd spent 3 decades running from everything and everyone now found himself responsible for something precious and fragile. It was a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but one he discovered he desperately needed. As sleep finally claimed him, Silas Gravedust McCrae began to dream not of the past, but of the future. A future where a man might earn redemption through kindness, where second chances were real, and where even the hardest hearts could learn to love again. The ghost town of Bitter Creek crouched in the valley like a wounded animal, its weathered buildings and broken dreams baking under the relentless Arizona sun. The Silas guided Jezebel down the main street, while Ghost, Shadow, and Dust padded alongside, their strength slowly returning after 2 days of careful feeding and rest. Most of Bitter Creek's businesses had closed years ago when the silver played out, but Elena's cantina still served travelers and the handful of stubborn souls who refused to abandon their claims. The dogs' ears perked up as they approached, picking up scents and sounds that spoke of life in this place of endings. Silas had barely dismounted when Elena appeared in the cantina's doorway, her dark hair streaked with premature silver, her face bearing the kind of weathered beauty that came from facing life's storms without flinching. She studied the 3 dogs with knowing eyes. "So," she said, her voice carrying the musical accent of her Mexican heritage, "Silas McCrae has become a rescuer of strays." "They needed help," he replied simply, surprised by the defensiveness in his own voice. Elena's expression softened as she watched Ghost settle protectively near Silas's feet. "Tommy would be proud. He always said you had a good heart buried under all that anger." Before Silas could respond, shouting erupted from the far end of town. A woman's voice, high and desperate, cut through the desert air like a blade. Elena's face went pale. "That's Maria Morales," she said, already moving toward the sound. "Something's happened to Jose." They found the scene at the Morales homestead, a modest adobe house surrounded by corrals that had once held cattle. Maria knelt beside her husband's body, her children clinging to her skirts, their faces streaked with tears and dust. Jose Morales lay sprawled in the dirt, his shirt dark with blood, his eyes staring sightlessly at the copper sky. Sheriff Warren, a nervous man who'd held his badge for only 6 months, stood helplessly nearby. His previous experience had been limited to breaking up saloon fights and tracking down stolen chickens. A murdered rancher was beyond his capabilities. "What happened here?" Elena asked gently, kneeling beside the grieving widow. "Men came in the night," Maria sobbed. "They wanted Jose to sell the land. When he refused, Her voice broke, unable to finish. Ghost, Shadow, and Dust moved through the scene with purpose that surprised Silas. Ghost's nose worked the ground around Jose's body while Shadow investigated the corrals. Dust, despite his small size, seemed to be tracking something that led toward the desert. "Dogs don't usually act like that," Sheriff Warren observed nervously. "Almost like they're hunting." Silas watched his companions with growing amazement. Their behavior wasn't random. It was methodical, professional, like they'd been trained for this kind of work. Ghost paused at a specific spot and looked back at Silas with unmistakable urgency. "What is it, boy?" Silas approached the spot where Ghost waited. Half buried in the dust lay a silver pocket watch, its chain broken, its surface scratched but still gleaming. Silas's hands trembled as he picked it up. Engraved on the back, in letters he'd watched being carved 20 years ago, were the words, "To my brother Tommy, with love always, S.M." The world seemed to tilt around him. This was the watch he'd given Tommy for his 18th birthday, saved for with money earned from their first bank robbery. Tommy had carried it every day until the gunfight in Prescott that supposedly claimed his life. "That's not possible," Silas whispered, turning the watch over in his palm. His brother had been buried wearing it. Silas had made sure of that, had fought off the undertaker to place it in Tommy's folded hands himself. Eleanor saw his expression and moved closer. "Silas, what is it?" He showed her the watch, watched her face go white with recognition. This was Tommy's. He was wearing it when he died. "Are you certain?" "I gave it to him. I put it in his hands at the funeral." Silas's voice was barely a whisper. "How did it get here?" Maria Morales looked up through her tears. "Jose found that watch 3 days ago. A man tried to trade it for water, but Jose recognized it. Said it belonged to Tommy McCrae, the one who used to visit Elena. Jose kept it, thought maybe someday he could return it to family." The implications hit Silas like a physical blow. If Tommy's watch was here, if someone had tried to trade it, then either his brother hadn't been buried with it, or Tommy hadn't died in Prescott at all. "There's something else," Elena said quietly. "Jose told me last week that strange men had been asking questions about old mining claims, about families who'd lived here for generations. He was scared, said they weren't the kind of men who took no for an answer." Shadow and Dust returned from their exploration, both agitated. Shadow carried something in his mouth, a scrap of expensive fabric, the kind worn by wealthy men in the cities. Dust had found boot prints, too clean and well-made for common cowboys. Clayton Hartwell, Elena said the name like a curse. "He's been buying up land all through the territory, using men who make Jose's killers look gentle." Silas knew the name. Clayton Hartwell owned half the businesses in Phoenix and had territorial politicians in his pocket. More importantly, Clayton had grown up with the McCrae brothers, had been their childhood friend before his family's money built walls between them. "Clayton knew Tommy," Silas said slowly. "They were close once before." The sound of approaching horses cut through his words. Dust alerted first, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Ghost and Shadow flanked Silas immediately, their hackles raised. Marshal Pike Henderson rode into the yard with 2 deputies, his weathered face grim with purpose. He'd been tracking Silas for so long that recognition was instant and mutual. "Silas McCrae," Henderson called, his hand resting on his gun butt. "You're under arrest for the murder of Jose Morales." "That's not possible," Elena protested. "Silas just arrived. Found his horse's tracks leading away from the scene," Henderson replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Been following them for hours." Silas studied the marshal's face and saw doubt there. Henderson was an honest lawman, the kind who followed evidence rather than assumptions. But he was also under pressure to bring in the most wanted outlaw in the territory. "Someone's playing games, Marshal," Silas said carefully, "using my reputation to cover their real work. That watch belonged to my brother, who died 20 years ago. How does a dead man's property end up at a fresh murder scene?" Henderson's eyes fixed on the silver timepiece. "That's Tommy McCrae's watch. I remember it from the Prescott incident." "Then you remember he was buried wearing it?" A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the desert wind and Maria's quiet weeping. The 3 dogs remained alert but non-threatening, sensing the delicate balance of the moment. Finally, Henderson spoke. "I'll give you 24 hours, McCrae. Find proof you didn't kill Jose Morales, or I come for you with everything I've got." It was more than Silas had any right to expect, and both men knew it. Henderson wheeled his horse around and rode away with his deputies, leaving Silas alone with the widowed family, Eleanor, and 3 dogs who'd somehow become his partners in a mystery that stretched back 20 years. As evening shadows lengthened across Bitter Creek, Silas stood holding his brother's watch and wondering if Tommy McCrae was really dead, or if someone had spent 2 decades letting him believe a lie. The dogs pressed close around him, their presence a comfort and a promise. Whatever the truth about Tommy, wherever this investigation led, Silas knew he couldn't walk away. Jose Morales deserved justice, Maria deserved answers, and somewhere in this web of violence and deceit lay the key to his brother's fate. Ghost looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, and Silas could swear the dog understood everything. They'd found each other for a reason, he and these three survivors. Now it was time to discover what that reason was. The massacre site lay 3 miles north of Bitter Creek, where Deadman's Wash cut a deep scar through the red earth. Silas found it following Ghost's remarkable tracking abilities. The dog seemed to read stories in the desert floor that no human could decipher. 43 cattle lay scattered across the arroyo, their bodies bloated in the heat, clouds of flies rising and settling in the still air. This wasn't rustling or even normal killing for meat. Someone had slaughtered the entire herd and left them to rot, the kind of waste that spoke of intimidation rather than profit. "Sweet Jesus," Elena whispered, covering her nose with her bandana. She'd insisted on coming despite Silas's protests, claiming her knowledge of the local families might prove useful. Ghost moved through the carnage with professional calm, his nose working methodically. Shadow explored the edges of the kill site, while Dust, despite his small size, seemed focused on a specific area near the washbank. Their behavior reminded Silas of military scouts he'd known during his brief stint in the territorial militia. Systematic, purposeful reading signs invisible to others. "Here," Silas called, kneeling where Dust had stopped. Partially buried in the sand lay a piece of cowhide, bearing a distinctive brand, the intertwined CH of Clayton Hartwell's ranch. "This ties Clayton directly to the killings." Elena examined the branded hide with growing anger. These were Miguel Sandoval's cattle. His family has ranched this land for 3 generations. At being the important word, Silas observed grimly. "Someone sending a message. Sell to Clayton or end up like your livestock." The memory came unbidden. Clayton Hartwell, as a boy of 12, fishing with Silas and Tommy in the creek behind their parents' ranch. Clayton had been different then, before his father's mining fortune built walls between the classes. They'd been genuine friends, the 3 of them, planning adventures and swearing blood brotherhood under the desert stars. Clayton wasn't always like this, Silas said. More to himself than Eleanor. Time was, he'd have been horrified by something like this. "Money changes people," Eleanor replied. "And power corrupts even good intentions." Ghost's sharp bark interrupted their conversation. The dog stood alert near the northern rim of the wash, his body rigid with attention. Shadow and Dust immediately joined him, forming a protective line between the humans and whatever approached. 6 riders emerged from the scrub, their faces hard under wide-brimmed hats, their hands resting casually on gun butts. Silas recognized the type, men who'd sold their souls so long ago they'd forgotten they'd ever had them. The leader, a thin man with pale eyes and a careful moustache, smiled without warmth. "Mr. McCrae, I presume. You're developing quite a reputation for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and you are." "Garrett Mills, foreman for the Hartwell Ranch. Mr. Hartwell sent me to deliver a message." Elena stepped closer to Silas, her hand moving to the small pistol she carried. The 3 dogs spread out slightly, creating better angles of coverage. Another bit of tactical awareness that surprised their human companions. "I'm listening," Silas said. "Mr. Hartwell remembers your friendship from childhood days. For old time's sake, he's willing to overlook certain recent interference. Leave the territory within 24 hours, and there'll be no hard feelings." The casual threat in Mills's voice sparked something dangerous in Silas's chest. These men had murdered Jose Morales, slaughtered innocent cattle, and terrorized families whose only crime was refusing to sell their heritage. "Tell Clayton I appreciate the offer," Silas replied evenly. "But I think I'll stick around." Mill's smile faded. "That would be unwise. Accidents happen to men who can't take good advice. Is that what happened to Jose Morales? An accident? Jose was a stubborn man who made poor choices. The desert is hard on stubborn men." Shadow tensed, a low growl building in his throat. The dog had positioned himself where he could attack Mills's horse, potentially creating chaos that would give Silas and Elena a chance to find cover. "We'll be going now," Mills said, gathering his reins. "But this conversation isn't over. Mr. Hartwell has invested too much in this territory to let sentiment interfere with business." As the riders departed, Ghost padded over to where their horses had stood and began working the ground with his nose. After a moment, he looked back at Silas with what could only be described as urgency. "What is it, boy?" Silas examined the spot where Ghost waited and found boot prints. Expensive leather, custom-made, with a distinctive pattern in the sole. More importantly, he found something else. A few strands of grey hair caught on a mesquite thorn. Too silver and fine to belong to any of the hired guns. Someone else was here, he told Elena. Someone important enough to wear custom boots and rich enough to afford them. Clayton himself. Maybe, or someone who reports directly to him. They buried the cattle as best they could, a grim task that took most of the afternoon. The dogs helped in their own way, Shadow and Dust dragging brush to cover the shallow graves while Ghost kept watch. It was hard, dirty work, but it felt necessary, a small act of respect for the innocent dead. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they made camp in a sheltered canyon a mile from the massacre site. Elena gathered firewood, while Silas tended to the horses and dogs. The domesticity of it struck him. How natural it felt to have companions again, to share the small responsibilities of survival. "You ever think about settling down?" Elena asked as they shared a simple supper of beans and coffee. "Finding a place where nobody knows your name, starting over?" Silas considered the question while scratching behind Ghost's ears. Used to think about it. But the past has a way of following a man, no matter how far he runs. Tommy thought about it. Toward the end, he talked about buying a small ranch, maybe raising horses instead of stealing them. I should have listened to him. Should have supported those dreams instead of laughing at them. Elena's eyes were gentle in the firelight. "Tommy knew you loved him, Silas. He never doubted that. But I failed him when it mattered most. Got him killed because I couldn't see past the next easy score." Ghost nuzzled against Silas's hand, and the simple gesture of comfort from an animal he'd saved struck him with unexpected force. These dogs had been dying when he found them, abandoned and helpless. Yet they'd chosen to trust him, to follow him, to accept his care despite everything they'd suffered. Maybe that was how redemption worked, not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but through small acts of kindness that built on each other day by day. On choice by choice, "We're going to find the truth about Tommy," he told Elena as the fire burned low. "Whatever it costs, whatever it takes. These people have hurt enough innocent families." The three dogs settled around their small camp, Ghost taking the first watch, while Shadow and Dust curled up near the dying flames. For the first time in 20 years, Silas McCrae fell asleep, surrounded by those who cared, whether he lived or died. But even in sleep, he dreamed of silver pocket watches and childhood friends who'd become strangers, of brothers lost and debts that could never be repaid. Shadow limped slightly as they approached Devil's Canyon, favoring his left hind leg, where a shard of barbed wire had cut deep during their escape from Bitter Creek. Silas had cleaned and bandaged the wound, but watching the dog's stoic acceptance of pain stirred something profound in the outlaw's weathered heart. "Easy there, boy," he murmured, kneeling to check the bandage. Shadow's dark eyes met his with patient trust, and Silas felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when Tommy was hurt and trying not to show it. Devil's Canyon earned its name from the treacherous rock formations that could trap an unwary rider, but it had served the McCrae brothers well as a hideout during their outlaw years. The hidden cave, where they'd stashed supplies and counted stolen money, lay concealed behind a curtain of desert willow and prickly pear. Ghost found the entrance first, his nose leading him straight to the narrow opening that human eyes would have missed. The dog paused at the threshold and looked back at Silas with an expression that seemed to say, "This is important." Inside the cave, 20 years of dust and desert mice had claimed most of Tommy's belongings, but a few items remained preserved. In an old cavalry ammunition box, a daguerreotype of their parents, some letters from a girl in Tucson, and a leather journal bound with rawhide cord. Elena watched silently as Silas opened the journal with trembling hands. Tommy's careful handwriting filled the pages, not the careless scrawl of an outlaw planning his next score, but the thoughtful words of a man wrestling with his conscience. I've been thinking about what Elena said, about making something honest of my life. Maybe she's right. Maybe it's not too late to be the man our parents raised us to be. The entries grew more frequent as Silas read, documenting Tommy's growing desire to leave the outlaw life behind. But the most shocking revelation came in the final pages, written just days before Tommy's supposed death in Prescott. Found out something terrible about Clayton. Caught him in Widow's Creek last week, standing over Bill Henderson's body with a smoking gun. Bill was Marshall Henderson's father. Clayton shot him down in cold blood over some old mining dispute. Clayton saw me watching, begged me to keep quiet, says he'll make it worth my while, give us both a fresh start if I keep his secret. But I can't live with this. Elena deserves better than a man who'd stay silent about murder. Going to ride to Prescott tomorrow, turn myself in, and tell the authorities what I saw. Maybe if I do right by Marshall Henderson's father, I can finally do right by Elena too. The journal slipped from Silas's numb fingers. Tommy hadn't died in a random gunfight. He'd been murdered to keep Clayton's secret safe. The whole story about a shootout in Prescott had been a lie, crafted to explain Tommy's disappearance and keep Silas from asking inconvenient questions. "My God," Elena whispered, reading over his shoulder. "Clayton killed your brother to cover up another murder. Dust had been exploring the deeper recesses of the cave while the humans read, and now he emerged carrying something in his small mouth. A folded piece of paper that had fallen behind the ammunition box. Elena unfolded it carefully, revealing an unfinished letter in Tommy's hand. "Dear Silas, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I've learned things about Clayton Hartwell that put both our lives in danger. He's not the boy we grew up with. There's darkness in him now, the kind that kills to protect itself. I'm going to do the right thing, even if it costs me everything. I should have done it years ago. You always tried to protect me, big brother, but this time I need to protect others. If I don't come back from Prescott, look for the truth in the places Clayton doesn't want you to search. And remember that I love you, no matter what mistakes we've made together. Your brother always, Tommy." The letter ended there, interrupted by whatever urgent business had called Tommy away. Silas stared at the unfinished words, feeling 20 years of grief and guilt crack open like an old wound. "He was trying to go legitimate," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, "trying to make amends for everything we'd done wrong." Elena knelt beside him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. "He loved you, Silas. That letter proves it, and I failed him. Should have been there, should have protected him from Clayton." Ghost moved closer, pressing his warm flank against Silas's leg. The dog seemed to sense his human's anguish and offered what comfort he could. Shadow and dust joined them, creating a circle of warmth and loyalty around their grieving companion. Outside the cave, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment of revelation. Marshall Henderson's voice carried clearly in the desert air. "Track leads into the canyon. He's holed up somewhere in those rocks." "We have to go," Elena urged, but Silas was already moving. He stuffed Tommy's journal and the unfinished letter into his jacket, grabbed what supplies they could carry, and followed the dogs toward the back exit of the cave. The narrow passage led to a hidden shelf of rock that offered a view of the canyon floor below. Henderson rode with 4 deputies, their faces grim with purpose. But as Silas watched, dust alerted to something else. More riders approaching from the opposite direction. Clayton Hartwell's men, led by the cold-eyed Mills, entered the canyon from the south. The two groups of riders faced each other across the rocky floor, unaware that their quarry watched from above. "Marshall Henderson," Mills called. "Fancy meeting you here." Mills: "I suppose you're here for the same reason I am. Mr. Hartwell has an interest in seeing justice done for Jose Morales' murder." Henderson's laugh held no humor. Clayton's idea of justice and mine might differ considerably. The tension below was thick enough to cut, and Silas realized he was witnessing something significant. the moment when the law and Clayton's private army faced off over his fate. But he also realized something else. This was his chance to turn the hunters against each other. Elena saw his expression and grabbed his arm. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. It's too dangerous." "Sometimes dangerous is the only way to get to the truth," Silas replied. "Tommy died because he was going to tell Marshal Henderson the truth about his father's murder. Maybe it's time that truth finally saw daylight." Ghost looked up at him with those wise brown eyes, and Silas could swear the dog understood the plan forming in his mind. They'd come this far together, outlaw, Mexican cantina owner, and 3 dogs who'd taught him about loyalty. Now it was time to finish what Tommy had started, whatever the cost. Below them, 2 armed groups faced each other in the desert heat, each believing they hunted a simple outlaw. Neither suspected they were about to become players in a 20-year-old game of murder and revenge. The surviving ranchers gathered at dawn in the ruins of an old Apache village, their faces carved by wind and worry into masks of grim determination. Miguel Sandoval spoke for the group, his weathered hands folded over the rifle that hadn't left his side since finding his slaughtered cattle. "Clayton's men came to my neighbor's place last night," Miguel reported. "The Hendersons, no relation to the marshal, they found their well poisoned, their horses shot. Message was clear: sell or face worse." Silas studied the circle of desperate men, recognizing the look of people pushed beyond their breaking point. Elena stood beside him, her presence lending credibility to his words among families who'd known her for years. The 3 dogs had positioned themselves strategically around the group, Ghost watching the approaches, Shadow monitoring their back trail, and Dust alert to sounds too subtle for human ears. "How many families has Clayton run off so far?" Silas asked. 17 in the past 6 months, answered Carlos Herrera, whose own ranch bordered the disputed territory. "Always the same pattern. Threats, sabotage, then violence if they don't sell." Ghost suddenly alerted, his ears pricked toward the eastern hills. Without warning, he trotted away from the group, following some scent or instinct the humans couldn't perceive. Shadow and Dust immediately followed, their behavior coordinated like a military unit. "Where are they going?" Elena asked, but Silas was already moving to follow his companions. The dogs led them to a hidden drawer where ancient petroglyphs covered the red sandstone walls. The symbols were old, older than Spanish missions, older than American settlements, speaking of a time when this land belonged to people who understood its sacred nature. At the base of the largest petroglyph, Dust began digging with focused intensity. His small paws worked at the sandy soil until he uncovered a clay tablet marked with native symbols, partially buried but perfectly preserved by the dry climate. Chief Running Bear emerged from the rocks as if summoned by his ancestors' spirits. The Chiricahua leader moved with the quiet dignity of a man who'd seen his world change beyond recognition but never surrendered his connection to the land. "You've found the boundary." "Marker," the chief said, examining the tablet. "This stone marks sacred ground, burial places of my grandfather's grandfather. Clayton knows this land is protected by treaty, but he believes white man's money is stronger than ancient law." Silas knelt beside the tablet, feeling the weight of centuries in the carved symbols. "Tommy respected your people, Chief. He understood that some things shouldn't be bought or sold. Your brother was a good man who found his way back to honor before his death. The spirits whispered his name when the wind was right." Running Bear's dark eyes fixed on Silas. "They whisper yours now too, Grave Dust. You carry his unfinished journey." The revelation struck Silas with unexpected force. Tommy's final mission hadn't just been about exposing Clayton's crimes. It had been about protecting this sacred land from desecration. The treaty violations, the murdered ranchers, the poisoned wells, all of it was connected to Clayton's obsession with claiming territory that was never meant to be owned. Elena touched his arm gently. "The families are waiting for your answer, Silas. Will you help them fight?" Before he could respond, the thunder of approaching horses echoed off the canyon walls. Clayton's hired killers had found them. led by a man whose reputation for violence exceeded even Mills's cold professionalism, Iron Jim. Cassidy rode at the head of a dozen gun hands, his scarred face twisted into a permanent sneer. He'd earned his nickname by using heated iron rods to extract information from uncooperative prisoners, and his presence meant Clayton was done with subtle intimidation. The ranchers scattered for cover among the ruins, while Ghost, Shadow, and Dust took defensive positions. The dogs seemed to possess an almost supernatural awareness of danger, their ears detecting the subtle sounds that preceded an attack. "Silas McCrae!" Cassidy's voice carried across the ruins like a physical threat. "Clayton's patience has run out. You've got 1 minute to show yourself, or we start killing innocent folks." From his concealment behind a fallen wall, Silas felt the familiar weight of his Colt Navy revolver. 20 years of gunfights had taught him to read the odds, and they weren't good. Clayton's men had superior numbers and position, while the ranchers were mostly farmers with more courage than shooting experience. Ghost appeared at his elbow, the dog's intelligent eyes meeting his with unmistakable communication. The animal jerked his head toward a section of ruins that would provide better angles of fire, then looked pointedly at Shadow and Dust. They were offering tactical advice, as if they'd fought battles before. "Where did you boys learn to think like soldiers?" Silas whispered, but there was no time for answers. The shooting started when Carlos Herrera's patience broke. His rifle cracked from behind a stone wall, and Cassidy's men responded with a volley that sent stone chips flying like shrapnel. The battle for the sacred ground had begun, and Silas found himself fighting not just for his own survival, but for families who'd never asked for this war. Elena proved herself a crack shot, her small pistol barking steadily as she covered the flanks. Chief Running Bear materialized and vanished among the rocks like a ghost, his ancient rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. But it was the dogs who turned the tide. Ghost led a flanking maneuver that brought him behind Cassidy's position, where his sudden attack spooked the horses and created chaos. Shadow darted between the gunman's legs, tripping them at crucial moments, while Dust's sharp barks provided warnings about movements the humans couldn't see. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Clayton's men lay dead, and the rest had retreated in disorder. Iron Jim Cassidy himself rode away with a bullet graze across his cheek, his reputation for invincibility shattered by an outlaw and 3 dogs. But victory came with a price. Miguel Sandoval had taken a bullet in the shoulder, and young Carlos showed a bloody furrow across his scalp. As they tended the wounded, Silas realized the fight was far from over. "This was just a probe," he told the gathered families. "Clayton's testing our strength, seeing what we're made of. Next time he'll come with everything he's got." Chief Running Bear nodded gravely. "The spirits of this place will stand with those who protect it. But the final battle must be fought by the living." As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Silas looked out over the sacred ground they'd defended and felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These people were counting on him, trusting a wanted outlaw to lead them against impossible odds. Ghost pressed against his leg, offering the comfort of loyalty and shared purpose. Whatever came next, whatever price Clayton demanded for this defiance, Silas knew he wouldn't face it alone. Tommy's unfinished mission had become his own, and he'd see it through to the end. The aftermath of the battle left a bitter taste in Silas's mouth, despite their tactical victory. 3 men lay dead in the ancient ruins, their blood seeping into sacred ground that had already seen too much violence. Miguel Sandoval's shoulder wound would heal, but the rancher's faith in peaceful solutions had died with the first shot. "This is what I've become," Silas told Elena as they tended the wounded. "A man who brings death wherever he goes." Elena paused in her work bandaging Carlos's scalp wound. "You brought protection to people who had none." "There's a difference," but Silas couldn't shake the feeling that his violent skills made him part of the problem rather than the solution. Ghost seemed to sense his internal struggle, pressing closer and offering the simple comfort of warm presence. Shadow and Dust flanked them both, creating a circle of loyalty that spoke louder than words. The dogs had surprised everyone during the fight, displaying tactical awareness that bordered on the supernatural. They'd moved like trained military animals, anticipating threats and coordinating their actions with an intelligence that defied explanation. "Where did you boys learn to fight like that?" Silas asked, scratching behind Ghost's ears. The big dog looked up at him with those wise brown eyes, and for a moment Silas could swear he saw the ghost of recognition, as if Ghost remembered other battles, the companions who trusted him with their lives. Marshal Pike Henderson arrived as the sun reached its zenith, riding alone into the ruins with his badge catching the harsh light. His weathered face showed the strain of a man caught between duty and justice, law and conscience. "Heard shooting," Henderson said simply, dismounting near the covered bodies. "Figured I'd find you in the middle of it." "Your choice, Marshal," Silas replied. "Arrest me now, or listen to what I've learned about your father's murder." Henderson's hand froze halfway to his gun butt. "My father died in a mining accident 20 years ago. Your father was murdered by Clayton Hartwell over a land dispute. My brother Tommy witnessed the killing, and Clayton had him murdered to keep the secret safe." Silas produced Tommy's journal and the unfinished letter, watching Henderson's face change as he read the devastating revelations. The marshal's hands trembled slightly as he absorbed the truth about his father's death. Bill Henderson was investigating illegal mining claims, the marshal said slowly. He'd found evidence of claim jumping, forged documents. "I always wondered why he was alone that night in Widow's Creek. Tommy saw Clayton standing over your father's body with a smoking gun. When my brother threatened to expose the truth, Clayton arranged his death and made it look like a gunfight in Prescott." Henderson stared at the journal for a long moment, then looked up at Silas with something that might have been respect. "My father's badge," he said, unpinning the worn silver star from his vest. He carved his initials into the back, said it would remind him that the law belonged to the people, not the politicians. The blood-stained badge bore the scratched initials W.H., William Henderson, a lawman who died trying to protect the same land his son now served. Henderson held it out to Silas, a gesture of trust that carried profound meaning. 20 years I've been chasing the wrong man," Henderson said, "while the real killer built an empire on my father's grave." Elena approached carefully, her medical supplies exhausted, but her determination intact. "There's something else you should know, Marshal. Clayton's poisoned the main water source for the valley. Families are getting sick, children are dying. The news hit Henderson like a physical blow. Environmental poisoning was an act of war against the entire community. The kind of crime that demanded federal intervention. Ghost, Shadow, and Dust found the contaminated spring yesterday," Silas added. "Led us right to barrels of arsenic dumped upstream. Clayton's willing to kill the land itself to get what he wants." The 3 dogs demonstrated their water-finding abilities by leading the group to a hidden spring that still ran clean and sweet. They worked as a team, Ghost locating the source, Shadow testing the safety, and Dust standing guard. Their coordination was remarkable, almost as if they'd been trained for exactly this kind of environmental rescue work. As they filled canteens and water barrels, Henderson shared his own disturbing news. "Federal marshals are coming next week to investigate the territorial corruption. If we can provide evidence of Clayton's crimes, they'll shut down his operation permanently. Evidence won't matter if there's nobody left alive to testify," Elena pointed out. "Clayton's escalating his tactics. After today's failure, he'll come at us with everything he's got." Silas knew she was right. The battle at the ruins had been a warning shot, Clayton's way of testing their resolve. The real assault would come soon, overwhelming force designed to crush resistance permanently. That evening, as they made camp in a defensible canyon, Silas found himself writing in Tommy's journal, the first time he'd tried to put his thoughts on paper in 20 years. Strange how 3 dying dogs changed everything. Ghost, Shadow, and Dust have become my teachers, showing me what loyalty means, what courage looks like when it's not driven by anger or desperation. They chose to trust me when they had every reason to fear humans. Maybe that's what redemption is, learning to be worthy of that trust. Elena sat beside him as the fire burned low, her presence a comfort he'd forgotten how to appreciate. Tommy would be proud of what you're becoming, Silas. Would he? I'm still a killer, still a man with blood on his hands. But now you're killing to protect the innocent, instead of just protecting yourself. That's the difference Tommy would have understood. Ghost raised his head from where he lay guarding the camp perimeter, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Shadow and Dust immediately joined him, their collective alertness indicating approaching danger. "Riders," Henderson said quietly, checking his rifle. "Moving carefully, trying to stay hidden. The attack came at midnight. Not Clayton's men this time, but hired killers from outside the territory, professionals who fought without conscience or mercy." The battle was fierce but brief, ending when Dust's warning bark allowed them to ambush the assassins in a narrow defile. When dawn broke over the bloodied canyon, 5 more men lay dead, and Silas realized they'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. Clayton had declared total war, and the only response was to carry that war to him. "We end this now," Silas told Henderson as they buried the dead. "Before more innocent people die," the marshal nodded grimly. "I'll deputize you officially. Make this a legal operation." Ghost looked up at Silas with those intelligent eyes, and the outlaw could swear the dog understood what was coming. The final confrontation with Clayton Hartwell would determine not just their survival, but the fate of everyone who called this hard land home. The Hartwell mansion crouched on its hilltop like a medieval fortress, all towers and battlements designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Silas had known this place as a boy, when Clayton's father had thrown elaborate parties for the territory's elite. Now it felt like a mausoleum, filled with the ghosts of better men. Getting inside required all the stealth skills 20 years of outlawry had taught him, plus the supernatural senses of his canine companions. Ghost led the way through gardens, gone wild with neglect, while Shadow found the servants' entrance that careless guards had left unmonitored. Dust, despite his small size, proved invaluable at detecting tripwires and other security measures. The mansion's interior reflected Clayton's transformation from idealistic boy to ruthless empire builder. Expensive paintings depicted scenes of conquest. Cavalry charges, mining operations, cattle drives that spoke of dominion over the land rather than harmony with it. But it was the trophy room that revealed the true depth of Clayton's obsession. Mounted on velvet-lined shelves were personal items taken from his victims, Marshal William Henderson's watch, Jose Morales' wedding ring, and dozens of other tokens representing lives destroyed in Clayton's march toward absolute power. Each trophy was carefully labeled with a date and location, like exhibits in a museum of murder. Ghost's hackles rose as they moved through the grotesque display, the dog's instincts recognizing the spiritual contamination of the place. Shadow and Dust flanked Silas protectively, their presence the only thing keeping him sane in this chamber of horrors. At the room's center stood an ornate mahogany desk, its surface covered with maps showing Clayton's territorial acquisitions. Red pins marked completed purchases, while black pins indicated problem properties still resisting his offers. The pattern was clear, a systematic campaign to control every valuable acre in the region, but it was the locked drawer that contained the real revelation. Silas's lock-picking skills, honed during his criminal years, made quick work of the mechanism. Inside lay a leather portfolio containing Clayton's most private correspondence, including a letter that made Silas's blood run cold. "My dear father, another year passes, and still I carry the burden of Michael's death. You always said it was an accident, that the mine shaft collapsed because of faulty supports. But I remember the anger in my eyes when I pushed him, remember the sound his body made hitting the rocks below. Michael was trying to stop me from cheating the Apache out of their sacred land. Said our family's honor meant more than profit. He was always the better son, the one you should have chosen as your heir. I've spent 20 years building an empire on that lie, telling myself that success would somehow balance the scales. But every acquisition reminds me of Michael's broken body. Every victory tastes like guilt. Tommy McCrae discovered the truth somehow, found Michael's bones in the old shaft, figured out they weren't where a cave-in would have left them. He threatened to expose everything unless I stopped the land grabbing and made restitution to the families I'd wronged. I couldn't let him destroy everything I'd built on Michael's grave, so I had him killed, just like I killed my own brother. The irony isn't lost on me, Father. In trying to hide one brother's murder, I committed another. Your son in darkness, Clayton. The letter slipped from Silas's numb fingers as the full scope of Clayton's madness became clear. This wasn't about land or money. It was about a man driven insane by fraternal guilt, killing anyone who reminded him of his original sin. Tommy had died, not because he'd witnessed Marshall Henderson's murder, but because he'd discovered that Clayton had killed his own younger brother decades earlier. Ghost whined softly, pressing against Silas's leg as if sensing the emotional earthquake shaking his human companion. The dog's warmth was an anchor in a world suddenly turned upside down. Michael Hartwell, Silas whispered to his companions. Clayton's younger brother. Everyone thought he died in a mining accident, but Clayton murdered him in cold blood. That's what Tommy really discovered. The sound of approaching footsteps sent the dogs into immediate alert mode. Shadow darted to the window, while Dust positioned himself by the door. Ghost remained close to Silas, ready to defend or retreat as the situation demanded. Clayton Hartwell entered his trophy room like a man visiting a shrine. His once handsome face, now bearing the ravages of decades, spent running from his conscience. He'd aged badly, his silver hair thinning, his expensive clothes unable to hide the spiritual decay beneath. "Silas McCrae," Clayton said without surprise. "I wondered when you'd finally come calling. Found my little museum interesting?" "Found your confession more interesting," Silas replied, holding up the letter. "Amazing what a man will admit to paper when his guilt eats him alive." Clayton's laugh held no humor. "Guilt? You think this is about guilt?" "This is about justice, Silas. Michael was going to betray our family, hand over land that had been ours for generations to savages who didn't understand its value. I stopped him, just like I stopped your bleeding heart, brother. Tommy was trying to go straight. He'd found love, found a reason to change. Tommy found my secret, and secrets are dangerous things in the wrong hands. Just like you're dangerous now, standing in my private space with evidence that could destroy me." Clayton's hand moved toward the pistol at his waist, but Ghost was faster. The dog launched himself across the room with a snarl, catching Clayton's gun arm in powerful jaws. The weapon discharged into the ceiling as man and dog crashed to the floor in a tangle of fury. Shadow and Dust joined the attack immediately, not to kill, but to immobilize. Their coordination was perfect. Shadow going for Clayton's legs, while Dust darted in to worry at his free hand. It was as if they'd rehearsed this moment, trained for it in some other life. The gunshot brought running feet and shouting voices. Clayton's houseguards would be here within minutes, and Silas faced a choice: escape with the evidence, or try to take Clayton alive for justice. "Call them off," Clayton screamed, trying to fend off 3 determined dogs. "Call them off and I'll tell you where Tommy's really buried." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. "What, your brother's not dead, you fool. I needed him alive to answer questions about what else he might have told people. He's been my prisoner for 20 years, chained in the old mine where I killed Michael. Every day he sees my brother's bones and knows what happens to people who cross me. The revelation shattered everything Silas thought he knew. Tommy was alive, imprisoned, tortured, broken perhaps, but alive. 20 years of grief had been built on a lie designed to keep Silas from searching for his brother." Ghost's growl deepened as Clayton tried to reach for a hidden knife, and the dog's teeth found their mark. Clayton screamed as blood began to flow, his expensive shirt darkening with crimson stains. "You can still save him," Clayton gasped. "Call off the dogs, and I'll tell you exactly where to find Tommy, but you have to choose now, my life or your brother's location." The sound of boots on marble floors was getting closer. Silas grabbed the confession letter and stuffed it inside his jacket. then whistled sharply. Ghost, Shadow, and Dust immediately disengaged from their victim and moved to his side, their training evident in their instant obedience. "The old Silver King mine," Clayton wheezed, clutching his wounded arm. "Shaft number 3, 40 feet down. He's been waiting for you, Silas, waiting and hoping for 20 years. As Clayton's guards burst into the trophy room, Silas and his canine companions were already diving through the window into the garden below. The dogs absorbed the impact and rolled, coming up running with their human between them. But as they raced through the darkness toward their horses, Silas carried a burden heavier than any bounty on his head. The knowledge that his brother had spent 2 decades in hell while he'd mourned a death that never happened. Ghost lay on his side in the flickering firelight, his breathing shallow and labored, dark blood matting the silver fur around the bullet wound in his flank. Clayton's parting shot had found its mark as they'd escaped through the mansion window, and now Silas knelt beside his wounded companion with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice breaking as he examined the wound. The bullet had passed through cleanly, missing vital organs, but leaving Ghost weak from blood loss. "You saved my life in there. Now let me save yours." Elena worked beside him with steady hands, her experience tending wounded ranch hands proving invaluable as she cleaned and dressed the injury. Ghost's dark eyes remained alert despite his pain, fixed on Silas's face with the kind of trust that humbled a man's soul. "He'll live," Elena said finally, "but he needs rest and care. This dog has the heart of a warrior, but even warriors have limits." Shadow and Dust pressed close to their injured packmate, offering comfort through their presence. The bond between the 3 animals had deepened during their trials together, becoming something that transcended mere survival instinct. They were family now, in the truest sense of the word. "Tommy's alive," Silas told Elena, the word still feeling strange on his tongue. 20 years I've been mourning a dead man while my brother suffered in Clayton's private hell." Elena's hand found his shoulder, offering comfort he didn't deserve. "You couldn't have known. Clayton made sure of that. But I should have looked harder, should have questioned the story about Prescott. Instead, I accepted it because grief was easier than hope." Marshal Henderson arrived as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of copper and gold. He rode with a small army behind him, federal marshals, territorial rangers, and a handful of soldiers from Fort Bowie. The evidence from Clayton's trophy room had galvanized the authorities into action. "We have enough proof to hang Clayton Hartwell 10 times over," Henderson reported. "His confession letter, the stolen items, the poisoned water sources, it's all documented now." Chief Running Bear emerged from the rocks with 24 Chiricahua warriors, their paint bright in the morning light. "The spirits demand justice for the sacred ground that was defiled," he said simply. "My people will stand with those who fight for the land's honor." Elena had spent the night organizing the ranchers and townspeople, creating an unlikely army of farmers, shopkeepers, and honest working folks who'd finally had enough of Clayton's tyranny. They weren't soldiers, but they were fighting for their homes and families, the kind of motivation that made ordinary people do extraordinary things. "How many men does Clayton have?" Henderson asked. "Maybe 40 gunmen at the mansion, plus whatever hired killers he can call in from other territories," Silas replied. "But they're mercenaries fighting for money. We're fighting for something more." Ghost struggled to his feet, determined to participate despite his injuries. The big dog's refusal to be left behind reminded Silas of his brother's stubborn courage, the kind of determination that had kept Tommy alive through 20 years of imprisonment. "The old Silver King mine is in the Devil's Triangle," Elena said, studying the maps Henderson had brought. "It's perfect for defense. High ground, limited approaches, and enough tunnels to hide an army. Or to trap one," Silas added grimly. "Clayton's had 20 years to prepare those tunnels. Could be booby traps, cave-ins, anything." The 3 dogs huddled together, and Silas could swear they were making plans of their own. Despite Ghost's injury, the animals seemed focused on the mission ahead, their intelligence and tactical awareness more evident than ever. "There's something else," Henderson said, his expression troubled. Clayton sent messages to every outlaw gang in the territory, promising pardons and gold to anyone who helps him. We could be facing 100 desperate men with nothing to lose. The weight of command settled on Silas's shoulders like a familiar burden. These people were looking to him for leadership, trusting a wanted outlaw to guide them through the valley of the shadow of death. It should have felt wrong, but instead it felt like destiny, as if every choice in his violent life had led to this moment. We go in at sunset, he decided. 3 groups. Henderson leads the frontal assault to draw their attention. Chief Running Bear takes his warriors through the eastern approaches, and I take a small team through the mine tunnels to find Tommy. That's suicide, Elena protested. You'll be trapped underground with no support. The dogs know those tunnels, Silas replied, watching Ghost's ears perk up at the mention of their destination. They've been trying to tell me something since we first met. Maybe this is what they were preparing for. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she was too proud to shed. Tommy's waited 20 years. He can wait a few more days while we plan this properly. No, Silas said firmly. Every day we delay is another day my brother suffers. Besides, Clayton knows we have the evidence now. He'll either kill Tommy to eliminate a witness, or he'll move him somewhere we'll never find him. The afternoon was spent in final preparations, checking weapons and reviewing the assault plan. Silas wrote what he believed might be his final letter, expressing gratitude for the dog's loyalty and Elena's love. Asking forgiveness for the mistakes that had cost so many lives, Chief Running Bear performed a blessing ceremony over their weapons, calling on the spirits of the sacred land to guide their aim and strengthen their resolve. The ancient rituals felt appropriate for what was essentially a holy war. Good versus evil, justice versus corruption, hope versus despair. Your brother's cross, Elena said, approaching Silas as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. In her hands lay a simple wooden cross that Tommy had carved as children, found among Clayton's grotesque trophy collection. Silas took the cross with reverent hands, feeling the rough wood that his brother's young fingers had shaped with love and faith. He made this for me when I was recovering from a fever, said it would protect me from harm. Maybe it will, Elena replied, helping him fasten the leather cord around his neck. And maybe Tommy's love will guide you through those dark tunnels to bring him home. Ghost approached on unsteady legs, his determination overriding his injuries. The dog carried something in his mouth, a sacred eagle feather the Chief Running Bear had blessed during the ceremony. He placed it at Silas's feet with the solemnity of a knight offering his sword to his king. He wants to come with you, Elena observed. All 3 of them do. Silas knelt and looked into Ghost's intelligent eyes, seeing reflected there the same stubborn courage that had defined Tommy's character. You sure about this, boy? Those tunnels are going to be dangerous. Ghost's tail wagged once decisively. Shadow and Dust moved to flank him, their body language making their intentions clear. They'd started this journey together at Widow's Ridge, and they intended to finish it the same way, as the sun touched the mountains and shadows began to lengthen across the desert. Silas mounted Jezebel and checked his weapons one final time. The Colt Navy revolver rode familiar and heavy on his hip, while Tommy's Winchester rifle rested in his saddle scabbard. But his real strength lay in the 3 dogs who would guide him through hell itself to save his brother. When this is over, he told Elena, we'll build something good on this land. A place where children can grow up safe, where families don't have to fear men like Clayton. Elena's kiss was soft and warm, tasting of hope and tomorrow. Come back to me, Silas McCrae. Come back with your brother. The assault began as planned, with Henderson's frontal attack drawing Clayton's defenders toward the mansion's main approaches. Chief Running Bear's warriors struck from the east like ghosts themselves, their war cries echoing off the canyon walls as they overwhelmed the outer perimeter. But Silas had eyes only for the dark mouth of the Silver King mine, where his brother had waited 20 years for rescue. Ghost, Shadow, and Dust preceded him into the tunnels, their senses guiding him through passages that reeked of death and despair. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay Tommy McCrae, and Silas would move heaven and earth to bring him home. The dawn assault erupted across Clayton's fortified compound like thunder breaking over the desert. Marshal Henderson's federal forces struck the main gates with coordinated precision, their rifles cracking in disciplined volleys, while Chief Running Bear's warriors materialized from the eastern rocks like avenging spirits. But 40 feet below ground, in the suffocating darkness of the Silver King mine, Silas McCrae followed 3 dogs through passages that reeked of despair and ancient death. Ghost led despite his wounds, his silver coat ghostly in the lamplight as he navigated tunnels that seemed designed by madness itself. The 3 dogs worked as a perfect team, Ghost tracking scents too subtle for human senses, Shadow finding secure footing in treacherous passages, and Dust alerting to dangers hidden in the darkness. Their coordination reminded Silas of military units he'd known, veterans who'd learned to trust each other with their lives. "Easy, boys," he whispered as they paused at a junction of tunnels. Above them, the sound of gunfire filtered through tons of rock, muffled but constant. Henderson was keeping Clayton's attention focused on the surface battle, while Silas searched for his brother in this underground hell. Ghost's ears pricked forward, and he padded down the left-hand passage with sudden urgency. Shadow and Dust flanked him immediately, their body language screaming danger ahead. 20 yards deeper, they found the first evidence of Clayton's true madness. Skeleton chained to the tunnel wall, still wearing the rotted remains of expensive clothing. Michael Hartwell's bones bore no signs of mining accident. The skull showed a clear fracture from blunt trauma, and the positioning suggested the body had been deliberately displayed as a warning. "Jesus," Silas breathed, understanding why Tommy had been imprisoned here. Every day for 20 years, his brother had stared at the evidence of Clayton's fraternal murder, a constant reminder of what happened to those who crossed the Hartwell Empire. Dust's sharp bark echoed off the tunnel walls as the small dog found another horror. Tripwires connected to charges of black powder, enough explosive to bring down the entire mine system. Clayton had booby-trapped his brother's tomb, ensuring that any rescue attempt would become a mass grave. Ghost collapsed suddenly, his wounded flank finally overwhelming his warrior's determination. The big dog's breathing came in labored pants as Silas knelt beside him, feeling the fever that spoke of infection setting in. "Stay with me." "Good boy," Silas urged, but Ghost's eyes were already growing distant. The dog had pushed himself beyond his limits, driven by loyalty and some deeper purpose that transcended mere animal instinct. Shadow and Dust pressed close to their pack leader, offering comfort through their presence. But their attention kept returning to the tunnel ahead, where a faint sound drifted through the darkness, the rhythmic clink of chains against stone. "Tommy," Silas whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. They found him in a natural cavern 40 feet below ground, chained to the wall beside Michael Hartwell's bones, like some grotesque display in Clayton's Museum of Murder. Tommy McCrae had aged 20 years in captivity, his hair gone white, his face gaunt with deprivation, but his eyes still held the spark of the idealistic boy who'd wanted to save wounded animals. "Silas?" Tommy's voice was barely a croak, thick with disbelief. "Is that really you, or has my mind finally snapped?" "It's me, little brother." Silas's hands trembled as he worked at the heavy chains with his lockpicks. "I'm here to take you home." Tommy's laugh held the edge of madness. "Home?" "I watched you die, Silas. Clayton showed me your body after the Prescott gunfight. Said you'd been shot trying to avenge my death." The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. Clayton hadn't just imprisoned Tommy, he'd convinced him that his brother was dead, that no rescue was coming, that hope itself was an illusion. "Clayton lied about everything," Silas said, the chains finally giving way to his desperate efforts. "I've been searching for you for 20 years, mourning a death that never happened." Above them, the sound of explosions shook dust from the tunnel ceiling. Clayton's men were using dynamite now, trying to collapse the approaches and trap Henderson's forces in killing zones. Tommy struggled to his feet with Silas's help, his legs weak from decades of captivity. "He's rigged this whole mine," Tommy warned. "One switch brings down the entire system. Clayton always said if he couldn't have his secret, he'd bury it forever. Ghost raised his head with tremendous effort, his eyes locking on something in the shadows behind Michael's bones. With his last strength, the dog crawled toward a leather satchel hidden in a crevice, Tommy's original evidence about Clayton's crimes, preserved through 20 years of imprisonment. Your dog, Tommy marveled, reaching out to touch Ghost's graying muzzle. He's beautiful. Where did you find him? He found me, Silas replied. All three of them did. Dying in barbed wire near Widow's Ridge, but they chose to trust me anyway. The sound of approaching boots echoed through the tunnels. Clayton's men had discovered the underground passages. Shadow and Dust immediately took defensive positions, their hackles raised as they prepared to buy their humans time to escape. But escape seemed impossible. The tunnel behind them was blocked by rubble from the explosions above, while the passage ahead led deeper into Clayton's rigged maze. They were trapped 40 feet underground with a man who'd spent 2 decades planning their deaths. Ghost's tail wagged once, weakly, and his eyes seemed to communicate something profound to Silas, a message of love and sacrifice that transcended species. The dog who taught an old outlaw how to care again was prepared to make the ultimate gift, as Clayton Hartwell's voice echoed through the tunnels, promising death to all who defied him. Silas held his brother close and prepared for the final confrontation that would determine whether love was stronger than hate, whether redemption was possible even in the deepest darkness. Clayton Hartwell descended into his underground tomb like a man approaching his own altar, his face twisted by 20 years of guilt and madness. The explosions above had trapped them all in this place of death. Silas, Tommy, the 3 dogs, and Clayton himself, locked together in the final act of a tragedy that had begun with one brother's murder of another. "Welcome to my gallery of mistakes," Clayton said, his voice echoing strangely in the cavern. "Michael, Tommy, and now you, Silas. All the McCrae brothers together at last in their final resting place." Ghost lay dying between the 2 men, his silver coat darkened with blood, but his eyes remained alert and intelligent. Shadow and Dust flanked their fallen leader, their loyalty unbroken even in the face of death. They formed a living barrier between Clayton and their human family. "It doesn't have to end this way," Silas said, supporting Tommy's weak frame while keeping his gun trained on Clayton. "You can still surrender, face trial, maybe find some kind of peace." Clayton's laugh was the sound of sanity breaking. "Peace. I killed my own brother, Silas, crushed his skull with a mining pick because he threatened to expose my land schemes. Every night for 20 years, I've heard Michael screaming my name in the darkness." Tommy stirred in Silas's arms, his voice barely a whisper. "That's why you kept me alive. You needed someone else to see Michael's bones, to share the weight of your guilt. You were supposed to understand." Clayton screamed, tears streaming down his weathered face. "You were supposed to realize that some secrets are worth killing for, that some sins can never be forgiven." The mine structure groaned ominously around them, weakened by the explosions above. Dust from the ceiling fell like snow, and the smell of black powder hung heavy in the air. Clayton's hand rested on a detonation switch connected to the remaining charges, enough explosive to seal the mine forever. Ghost's condition worsened with each labored breath, but the dog used his remaining strength to crawl toward Tommy. With infinite gentleness, the dying animal nuzzled the freed prisoner's hand, offering comfort to a man who'd known nothing but pain for 2 decades. "Your dog," Tommy whispered in wonder. "He's trying to tell me something." Silas watched in amazement as Ghost dragged himself to where Michael Hartwell's bones lay chained to the wall. The dog's nose worked it. Something hidden among the remains, a small, leather-bound book that had somehow survived 20 years in the damp. Cave. Tommy's Bible, the scripture that had sustained him through captivity, hidden where Clayton would never think to look. Ghost had somehow known it was there, guided by instincts that transcended normal animal behavior. He was a military dog, Tommy said suddenly, understanding flooding his voice as he watched Ghost's professional movements. All 3 of them were trained for search and rescue, battlefield medicine, bomb detection. That's why they found you, Silas. They recognized a soldier in need. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. These weren't ordinary strays he'd saved. They were veterans, survivors of some forgotten campaign who'd been abandoned and left to die. Like him, they'd been broken by violence and healed by the simple act of being needed. Clayton's hand trembled on the detonation switch, his madness warring with some final vestige of conscience. Michael was going to betray everything our family built. He said the Apache had rights to their sacred land, that profit didn't justify theft. He chose them over his own blood. So you chose murder over justice, Silas replied. But you don't have to keep choosing it. Let us go, Clayton. End this cycle of death. For a moment Clayton seemed to waver, his eyes fixed on the dying dog who'd shown more courage and loyalty than any human in his experience. Ghost's sacrifice for strangers shamed him in ways that years of guilt had not. But madness won, as it always did with Clayton Hartwell. His hand slammed down on the detonation switch just as Ghost summoned his last strength for one final act of heroism. The dog launched himself at Clayton with the fury of a dying warrior, his teeth finding the man's throat in a grip that spoke of military training and absolute determination. Shadow and Dust joined the attack instantly, their coordination perfect as they brought down the man who'd brought so much pain to innocent lives. The charges detonated in sequence, bringing down tons of rock and sealing the main tunnels. But Ghost's sacrifice had delayed the explosion just long enough for the three men to reach the emergency shaft that Tommy remembered from his imprisonment, a narrow passage that led to an abandoned mining claim half a mile away. Tommy's Bible lay open in the rubble where Ghost had found it. Its pages turned to a passage about forgiveness and redemption. The dying dog's eyes fixed on Silas one last time, and in that gaze, the outlaw saw everything that mattered: love, loyalty, sacrifice, and the peace that comes from completing one's mission. Ghost died as he had lived, protecting those he loved, teaching by example what it meant to be truly noble. In his final moments, he'd shown Clayton Hartwell the difference between a man and a beast, between love and hate, between redemption and damnation. As the mine collapsed around them, Silas carried his dying brother toward the light, while Shadow and Dust led the way, three survivors bound by love and loss, emerging from darkness into a world where justice finally had a chance to heal the wounds of the past. 6 months after the collapse of the Silver King mine, Silas McCrae knelt beside a simple wooden headstone on a hill overlooking the valley where it all began. The marker bore an inscription carved with his own hands. Ghost, he taught an old outlaw how to love again. Shadow and Dust lay on either side of their fallen leader's grave, their presence a constant vigil that spoke of loyalty transcending death. They'd never quite recovered from losing Ghost, but they'd found purpose in continuing his mission of healing and protection. The small cabin Silas had built nearby was modest but comfortable, with windows facing east toward the sunrise, and a covered porch where Tommy could sit on good days. His brother's recovery had been slow and painful. 20 years of captivity had broken his body in ways that might never fully heal, but his spirit remained unbroken. Elena's coming up the road. Tommy observed from his rocking chair, his voice stronger than it had been in months. She's got that look that means she's bringing news. Silas rose from beside Ghost's grave, brushing dust from his knees. The bounty on his head had been officially pardoned after his testimony helped convict dozens of Clayton's associates. Marshal Henderson, now the territorial sheriff, had made sure the federal prosecutors understood Silas's role in bringing justice to the region. Elena approached with a bundle in her arms, her face glowing with a joy that transformed her features. "I wanted you both to meet someone," she said, pulling back the blanket to reveal a tiny face with Tommy's eyes and her own dark hair. "Tommy McCrae Vasquez," she announced, "named for his father, who left me one last gift before he tried to save the world." Silas stared at his nephew, his brother's son, born 9 months after conception, during those brief days when Tommy had escaped to visit Elena before his supposed death in Prescott. The baby was the living proof that love could triumph over even the darkest circumstances. "He's beautiful," Tommy whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Can I—" Elena placed the infant in his father's arms with infinite gentleness. Tommy held his son like he was made of spun glass, marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength. Shadow and Dust approached cautiously, their canine instincts recognizing the precious nature of this new pack member. They positioned themselves protectively around the rocking chair, already taking their roles as guardians seriously. "The territorial governor wants to establish an official animal rescue station here," Elena continued. "Marshal Henderson thinks you'd be perfect to run it, Silas. Help train dogs for search and rescue, law enforcement work." The idea appealed to him more than he'd expected. Ghost, Shadow, and Dust had shown him the potential that existed in abandoned animals, the capacity for courage, loyalty, and love that society had thrown away. Maybe he could help other broken spirits find their purpose. "What do you think, boys?" he asked Shadow and Dust. Both dogs wagged their tails enthusiastically, as if they understood exactly what kind of work lay ahead. Children from the surrounding ranches had begun visiting regularly, drawn by stories of the brave dogs who'd saved everyone from Clayton's tyranny. Silas found himself telling tales of Ghost's courage, Shadow's intelligence, and Dust's determination, watching young faces light up with wonder and inspiration. "Tell us about the fight in the mine again," 8-year-old Maria Sandoval had begged just yesterday. "Tell us how Ghost saved everybody." And Silas would tell the story, careful to emphasize the values Ghost had embodied: selflessness, loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice for others. Each telling was a way of keeping his friend's memory alive, of passing on the lessons a dying dog had taught a hardened outlaw about redemption. Clayton Hartwell's empire had crumbled with his death. His ill-gotten lands returned to their rightful owners or placed under federal protection. The sacred Apache burial grounds were safe forever, protected by treaty and guarded by Chief Running Bear's people. Justice had finally been served, though the cost had been higher than anyone should have to pay. Tommy kept a journal now, writing down his memories of captivity and recovery, but also his hopes for the future. "I want little Tommy to grow up knowing his Uncle Silas," he'd written in yesterday's entry. "I want him to understand that good men can come from bad circumstances, that it's never too late to choose love over hate." As evening approached and shadows lengthened across the valley, the small family gathered on the cabin porch. Elena sat beside Tommy, their son sleeping peacefully in her arms. Silas settled into his own chair with Shadow and Dust flanking him like living reminders of the price of redemption. The sunset painted the western mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had witnessed so much violence and loss over the years. But tonight those ancient peaks looked down on something new, a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice, sacrifice, and love. "Think Ghost knows?" Tommy asked quietly, his eyes fixed on the distant grave marker. "He knows," Silas replied with certainty. "He can see what grew from the seeds he planted. A family, a home, a future worth dying for." Shadow's ears perked up as the sound of approaching horses drifted across the valley. Not the thunder of pursued outlaws or hired killers this time, but the gentle clip-clop of neighbors coming to visit, bringing news and friendship to the cabin on the hill. As the first visitors crested the ridge, Silas McCrae smiled and rose to greet them. He was no longer grave dust, the wanted outlaw who'd brought death wherever he rode. He was simply a man who'd learned from 3 dying dogs that love was the strongest force in the universe, and that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to accept it. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the truth that Ghost had died to protect, that even the hardest hearts could learn to love again, and that sometimes salvation came on 4 legs with a wagging tail and an unbreakable spirit. Total word count, 15,150 words.